Model take to build?
Well, we've taken it apart a couple times, so it's probably a couple of weeks.
Yeah.
And then we present it to the client and we make some changes and tweak things here and there. So we pull it apart and put it back together, and it truly is a study model in that way. It's not supposed to be a finished product as much as it is really showing them what it might look like.
So tell me about some of these stadiums.
Some of these are some of my built work. This was actually a competition for a project in Seoul when the Seoul was up for the World Cup with Japan, and it was a baseball park that was wrapped with 3 million square feet of retail, and there was a department store. We actually even had apartments built in under the scoreboards, and it was this very Asian idea of mixed use at an extreme level.
It's a beautiful building, too.
Yeah, we were real excited because it won the competition, and they were about to pull the trigger, and then the Korean economy ran into trouble, and they put the project on hold, and when it came back, they did more open stadiums and a lot simpler than what this was anticipated to be. Philadelphia Eagles is now built, and that's always been one that I was very passionate about. I love the Eagles as a team, and so it's been fun to be part of creating a new home for them. A couple of little study models.
Actually, show me the Japanese.
The Japanese one?
Yeah.
So this is the project we talked about a little bit. It's in Saitama, which is about an hour north of Tokyo. I think this drawing tells it best, where the main part of the building is an arena that's about the size of Los Angeles Staples Center, so that's 20,000 seats. And then electronically, these 10,000 seats slide back, and it becomes a football stadium. Seats fill in the middle where that moves. And when it's in the arena configuration, this becomes a field house for like local, they can do volleyball tournaments and things like that, so they can actually use two parts of the building at the same time, which is really interesting.
That's cool.
Yeah. Yeah, it's funny. People often think because I've done so many of them that I just decided one day to be a sports architect, but that was actually kind of accidental. I started my career doing office buildings and skyscrapers all over the world, but none of them were getting built. And a friend of mine said, hey, there's this opportunity in Kansas City, of all places, where most of the world's sports architects all existed in Kansas City. And every league, basketball, football, baseball, hockey, were all getting new buildings at the time. So even in the recession in the early 90s, late 80s, those buildings were getting built. So I went to Kansas City and started, I learned the secret, stayed there for a couple of years, and then came out to LA and started a practice as a sports and entertainment architect.
How do you get into it? Do you have to have the understanding of how to build a large structure first? Or?
Kind of. Well, I certainly had enough experience with doing complex buildings, but it was an interesting anomaly, I think, in the profession, in the U.S. anyway, that they were very specialized in terms of there were a few architects that had done the new stadiums, and so the clients, because the clients are all very closely connected in the leagues, it's like a club. So they tended to go to the same architect. So what you had was very few architects controlling the entire market.
Yeah.
So I did it by going to work for one of those architects, getting a sense for what the issues were, and in reality it's not rocket science any more than any other complex building, but there are certainly concerns and issues that you have to think about, like when you put seats in a certain place, or how you organize the structure of a stadium, how that affects the whole thing. So.
Yeah. What makes a great stadium?
Yeah, it's something we strive for, I think, every time, and I don't know that there's a standard answer for every place. I think one thing is that the stadium truly is of its place, because these buildings are, people are so passionate about them. They represent the team, they represent their city. So I don't think you could do a cookie cutter approach like one great stadium. Baltimore, for example, has always been a great ballpark and really changed how ballparks were built. That wouldn't make as much sense in downtown New York or Tokyo, for example, definitely not. So I think we look for things that really connect to the passion of the people and teams, and then you try and bring out those things in the architecture. Can you create the feeling and the spectacle that really connects to the passion of the team?
Yeah. Have you ever seen a failure? I asked Steve Jones, who designs restaurants, and he
Sure.
gave me some good examples of things that he's seen that didn't work.
Yeah, trying to think of some of the more famous ones. I mean, I used to say that, when I did Safeco Field, it wasn't that long. The Kingdom had only been around, 15 years, and I remember being interviewed and asked about, can you believe they built this building like this enclosed concrete dome? And I said it was a little like bell bottoms. It seemed like a really good idea at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, there was this whole drive in the late 60s and early 70s that, well, why can't we build one stadium that can be football and baseball, and you save a lot of money building just one stadium. But in reality, what they lost was that the fun of baseball was the quirkiness and the different angles. And so it wasn't, as soon as you try and put that ballpark in this very big symmetrical building and seats are away from the game, you totally lose the connection to the game.
Yeah. What's one stadium you wish you had designed? Is
The-
it San Francisco?
No, I mean, I like it. It's a beautiful ballpark. I like to do buildings that are contemporary. So, I mean, I've done some that are sort of retro in that way that a lot of baseball parks are, but it's not my favorite thing to do. The stadium I wish I would have designed is the Beijing Stadium.
Why?
For the Olympics, because it's such a beautiful object. It has a great symbolism that really connects to Chinese culture and art, and just this sort of beauty and simplicity of the bird's nest as a metaphor. And I competed for it, and it was interesting how we believed in kind of an American way that, well, China's not going to spend a lot of money on the Olympics, so you have to come up with a very simple solution. In the end, it wasn't about that at all. They picked something that was very symbolic and a very difficult building to build, but it truly is going to be a piece of architecture that I think will become their Eiffel Tower.
Interesting. When you start thinking about a project like the Los Angeles football stadium, how do you start? How do you you have that white wall and you get to think about, man, I can dream and I can put whatever I want onto this. But
it's funny. It for me at least, it usually starts with a napkin. I mean, it's kind of a cliche, but it truly. I carry around little sketchbooks and little pads of paper, and it's usually some really visceral, tiny little sketch. Staples Center, for example, I still have that sketch, and it's amazing to me how it's very similar to that, and it's kind of absurd sometimes when I think, wow, somehow that little sketch, and now $300 million later, and it's built. But there's usually some driving idea that starts it. It's not as sort of blue sky as you might imagine. In the case of the NFL, there was this problem about stadiums were becoming so expensive that it just was becoming prohibitive to get a team back in Los Angeles because there's no public money for these buildings. So if you have to spend over $1 billion, it just isn't going to make sense. So we started with the idea that we have to make the stadium much simpler. So what do? You start to take out areas. You don't enclose areas as much, and here, because of the weather, we can do that. You can expose decks and have outdoor clubs and outdoor concourses that in most buildings they would have to all be conditioned and weather tight. And so those ideas then start to generate little sketches of, well, what if we simplified the building? It wasn't as tall and we spread it out a little bit more, and those little sketches start to grow into more detailed sketches, and then pretty soon we start building models, and it all kind of just emerges.
do you, when I was talking to Steve Jones, a restaurant architect, he cares a lot about light and lighting. Do you care about that? Is that something you think about, how it looks at night or with lights on it or in the sunset?
Well, definitely. The thing about exterior lighting, about the building, for me, it's always been about the building coming alive. That there's something about, particularly with these buildings, that when they even talk about them being dark when there's not an event, and it's both literal and metaphorical in that way. But So the lighting, and back to like the Beijing Stadium, the thing glows, you know, and Staples Center, if you've seen it during a playoff game or something, the tracking lights and the purple lights on the bowl of the building, that was all very conscious in the early sketches even. So lighting in my buildings becomes such an important part of the event. People know something's happening, the building's glowing. I actually had one of my son's friends, when I first took him along with us to Staples Center, he said, yeah, it glows. I like buildings that glow. I think that's a good thing. And he was 8 years old at the time, and I thought, yeah, that's pretty cool. You know, maybe we're going to make our buildings glow. It's like the Apple lap book. You know, it's alive when it does that.
Interesting. You have an Apple iPhone, which you just waited in line for. I did too, although I could, which I'm taking a little bit of heat for. But do you have that similar aesthetic understanding of? One thing I like when I walk into an Apple store or study an Apple product or how it was built, they care about weird things that most people wouldn't care about. They care about the box, you know, which probably most people say that gets thrown away. So why spend all this attention on the box? Or if you walk into the Apple store, the wood on the counters are very specific kind of wood, and the flooring is it all fits together, right? Somebody spent some attention on that. They didn't just buy some tile and put it down. You know?
Right. Oh, I think it's brilliant, and the stores in particular are brilliant because they found a way to translate the experience and the things that people care about the Apple products. That, you know, they're almost they're objects people fall in love with. They're beautiful to touch. The detail is elegant and simple, and everything is thought out, like you said, and it translated into the stores really well, I think. Yeah. It's one of those things that I aspire to. I mean, architecture is a little bit more difficult because there's so many components to it and things. But I often will talk to clients about product design. And more than once I've used the analogy, I'd much rather be Apple than Microsoft. You know, I don't want to do them all. I want to do the really beautiful ones and the ones where the other part of that design is they realize they're incredibly sensitive to that the sense of touch and aesthetic is so important to the experience. Yeah. You know, you love this object, you treat it differently.
Yeah. Shoreline Amphitheater, when they built that, had an interesting innovation. They had, I think, twice or three times more women's bathrooms than they had men's bathrooms, because the line in the women's bathrooms is always longer than the line for the men, for obvious reasons, right?
Right.
Do you think about it at that level? Like, what's the experience of walking through the hall, or do you just care about the outside of the? Oh,
no. Definitely the entire experience is taken into account. And the issue of more women's restrooms than men's restrooms was an advancement that probably hit in the 80s. Yeah. You know, it was so, and it was interesting. That was like a technological breakthrough. Oh my God, we're going to put more women's restrooms. Now it's things like, you know, what can you do in the clubs that will make people want to stay longer after the game, which takes pressure off parking situations and things like that. So it's big screen technology, it's sound, it's you know, the lighting and event. Like Staples Center, you get so much of the show isn't even about the game anymore. You know, it's about the video tracing around the building. It's about the projection on the scoreboard. Scoreboard technology is a huge issue. Yeah. So all
and
of that
that's changing
stuff.
quite fast. I just was in the museum. They have a $3 million screen right in the center of the museum, which is a 2 million pixel display, right? Yeah. Do you study how the technology is changing and what it lets you do inside the stadium?
Absolutely. And just about every owner, it's another thing, because they're all so connected, the next building wants to be as good or better than the last building always. So we always have to say, okay, where is scoreboard technology right now? What can be done that wasn't done before? But I'm also often checking the client back. I mean, or when I've been asked about the future of the stadium, I said, you know, it's always easy to talk about technology and where technology is taking us. Sometimes you have to look back. I mean, the Coliseum was an incredible building. You know, it had many layers. It had technology in the way things were staged and all. That's still good today. I mean, very similar to what we do today. And one of my favorite places in the world is Siena, Italy, where they run a horse race twice a year called the Palio, and all the villages around the center of the city come together, and they each have their horse in the race. And what's amazing is that the public square where most tourists go, and that's what their view of Siena is, that becomes the venue. And so I've always thought, what an interesting idea that the stadium is the town square. When it's not being used, it's the town square, but it can become a stadium. Now there's a very flexible, interesting idea that, you know, blows away the Japan stadium and its amount of flexibility. But yeah, it's a very old idea. So.
Do you visit museums or think about other kinds of spaces, or what hits emotion? You know, when the director of the museum was giving me a tour around, he said they have a whole 9/11 exhibit. And he said the dwell time there is way off the charts, that they never expected. The dwell time is how many minutes you spend in a room, and they said it's 45 minutes just in that one room.
Wow.
And he said that's off the top because there's so much to do in Washington, D.C. You know, and to spend 45 minutes in one room tells me that we hit it. We nailed the human experience that, you know, a museum should have. Do you study other kinds of buildings?
Absolutely. In fact, it was. I mentioned earlier that one of the ways I was successful in sports architecture was that I hadn't done it before. And so I started to sound different to clients. Clients talking to other sports architects, usually their references were other stadiums. And while that's important, you can only hear about Yankee Stadium or Ebbets Field so many times. I started to talk to them about the lobby in a W hotel, or a museum, or a resort, or, you know, other places where people like to hang out. And because that's really what this is about. Over and above the game, it's an entertainment experience. And so we started to take clients to other places. And the Philadelphia client flew us to Paris, and I took them to Pompidou just because Pompidou has that great plaza out in front of it. And they actually, at the time, they were under renovation, and they had a huge banner of scaffolding. And the scaffolding became a piece of art, and so that started to influence how we started to cover the ramps in the stadium. They liked that idea that came off of the Modern Art Museum in Paris. So, you know, you'd never think that those kind of references would make their way into a football stadium, but it happens a lot.
Wow.
One of the sort of accidents that happens too is the other thing is to pay attention. You can put all the seats in the right places and organize it just the way every other stadium's been done, and you never know, different people will react different ways. We built a stadium in Cincinnati, and the client was, it was interesting, he asked the question, I suppose they all have to look the same because they all have been built that way, and we have a hard time selling corner seats. And I said, well, we don't have to build them then, let's just take the corner seats out. And the interesting advantage that we didn't even anticipate was as soon as we pulled those corner seats away, we found they'd be willing to sit 10 rows higher on the 50-yard line than they would really low in the corner because they're on the 50-yard line. They can tell their friends, I have 50-yard line seats. Doesn't matter, I'm up really high, I'm on the 50-yard line. So that was one advantage. The second advantage, you can see in and out of the stadium. So all of a sudden you had a kind of ballpark feel rather than a football stadium feel where you can sit in your seats, you can see the river, you can see the bridges, and people driving by can see all those people in the game. That's a big deal. And then the real surprise was these open corners now where no seats were. We found that people would go to the concession areas and they'd buy a beer and they'd come and stand in the corner and watch the game, and they'd start hanging out with people, go buy another beer, watch the game. They wouldn't even go back to their seats. So we found that there was this sort of accidental human interaction space that made the event that much better.
Yeah, that's one thing. You didn't build the San Francisco Stadium, but that's one thing I like about the San Francisco Stadium. You can walk around the entire stadium and go check out the rich people's seats, check out the poor people's seats, and in fact, you can watch the game for free from the outfield, right? And including in the World Series. I was out in the World Series watching. Barry Bonds.
Well, it's a great tradition.
In the free seat.
In baseball, in particular, that's a great tradition, and that ballpark is great because it's on the water, and again, it's very open, sort of integrated with its site feel.
Yeah. Tell me a little bit about the technology of stadium. Earlier, you showed me the Japanese stadium. We'll get that on camera later, but tell me how that idea happened.
Yeah, The Japanese client came to us and said that they wanted to build they were going to build a stadium. The initial driver was that they needed a J-League soccer stadium, and J-League is smaller than the kind of European soccer clubs, they could be happy with 30,000 seats. They also wanted to have American football exhibition games, but they realized that to have a number of events, they needed an arena. So they were concerned, is there a way that we could do both? And the only model at the time was the Alamo Dome, I think, that was where basically it was a football stadium where they moved seats in really tight to play. Oh, it was San Antonio, yeah. And to play basketball. So again, both sports were compromised. It wasn't great for either one. So we said, well, because the land costs are so expensive there, it might make sense to look at technology. Could you really transform it? And for me, I've always been a bit of a robot collector, and I love Japanese technology and toys, and I had some of the early transformer robots and things that you could turn a robot into a car and that kind of thing. So that became the early metaphor for why not pull this thing apart and let it pop and move and do what it needs to do. And I built a very simple model of, okay, here's an arena. If you pull this back and you put some seats in there, you turn it into a football stadium. Well, it's pretty easy to do at this scale. To do it at the scale of a 30,000 seat stadium is much different. And but the Japanese were incredible. They figured out the technology of plumbing connections that will unplug, slide back, plug back in. And I've only got to see it move once. I mean, I've been in it in both configurations, but I got to go there one time while it was moving, and it was incredible. It's silent, and you see 10,000 seats moving, and these stainless steel connections that just slide down, and plumbing and everything reconnecting. It's this amazing machine.
Wow.
Yeah.
You told me a little bit that you want to get out of the sports world and go back to doing other kinds of things. What kinds of things do you want to do? What kinds of projects would get you excited to wake up in the morning?
Well, I think I would look for ways that what we do can overlap with other uses. Like the same exciting. We're gonna get. I didn't think about this problem.
That's all right.
We can edit.
No, that's
okay. The same kinds of things that get people excited about stadiums and arenas will apply to resorts and convention centers. Long span buildings that are really about events and conferences and things like that. So, but a lot of hotels, it's one of the things I'm really excited about, because again, that's a building where you go to escape. You want a different kind of experience. So it's similar for me in many ways. So the large resort casinos and
so you want Steve Wynn to call you?
Yeah, that would be good. I worked in Las Vegas for a while, and I've always been amazed by the driver that city is to, the architecture there is over the top, and I think it's also due for some evolution in terms of the experience. So.
Well, I was thinking, I was talking to Dave Marin, who works at Facebook, is the head of the Facebook platform, and I said, imagine if you had a Facebook hotel.
Yeah.
What kind of experiences you can build for people. Because
Yeah.
you would know everything about them. You would know what kind of music they like, what kind of photography they take, what kinds of hobbies they have. You could arrange little hobby things, you're into scuba diving, we're teaching a scuba diving class.
Yeah. Well, see, that's where those opportunities are. I mean, hotels are so much about interaction and experience and escape. And so, I love doing sports, so it's not that I would ever say, it'll always be part of what I do, but I'd love to leverage it into some other things.
Yeah. Where do you go for your inspiration? You told me a little bit about traveling and taking.
Yeah, I travel a lot. I certainly make a pilgrimage every year to Paris and to Venice and Italy, and I collect little Italian sketchbooks, and that's always one of my excuses for going back there. But it tends to be pretty mixed up. I mean, I'm fortunate to travel a lot. I go to Asia a lot. Paris is always a great city for art and architecture, and what's new in Europe. And but there's nothing like Asia for how do you blend culture and technology. And I've always seen Tokyo. Tokyo is such an amazing look into the future of what cities could be. It's clean, it's beautiful. Everything is thought out and worked out.
Yeah.
And
how does that compare to like Shanghai? Because I was in Shanghai 10 years ago when they were just going through the building boom. We counted 60 major skyscrapers being built at the same time, which is just absolutely incredible.
Oh,
yeah.
go to Dubai.
Dubai's even bigger. Yeah, I just saw a picture of Dubai. It's,
I mean, both of those are, Tokyo is a beautiful place and it seems so well planned, even though obviously it's not grid-like like New York, but beautiful parks and everything's clean and green. And Shanghai feels a little like the Wild West in that way, skyscrapers popping up and historic buildings being raised as fast as they can do it. I remember a friend of mine there that was showing me around said, we feel like we're 20 years behind the West, but we're going to work 24 hours a day, and we've got, how many billion people thinking that way to catch up. So they're going to catch up pretty quick, I think.
Yeah.
Dubai is even crazier because unlike Shanghai, where you see buildings like however many you can count, they're all in sort of different places. In Dubai, you can count 100 skyscrapers and they're all in the same place. And it tells you that it's not market driven by any stretch. They just decided they're going to build them all. And it's just shocking to see a city that large just sprout out of nowhere at one time.
Wow. Where do we go with this? Technology, how is that changing how you work or what you think about?
Yeah, I think that more than anything, technology is making things, well, here's a sort of interesting aspect about this. I think that I can do things with a small, nimble practice because of technology that years ago, not very many years ago, I would have had to be part of a much larger firm to accomplish. The fact that I can jump on a plane with a small scanner and a small printer, my BlackBerry and my iPhone, and I can make a major presentation between the time I get on the plane and the time I land. It's hard to imagine how I would have done that 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so that allows a small practice to be a global practice.
Yeah.
You're constantly connected. I know people worry that, well, do you ever relax and things like that. The BlackBerry and the iPhone and the internet for me has always been, it allows me to relax because I can be in Italy and I know that everything, if I get something, I can respond to it, send it off and forget about it. It used to be that I would get a phone call in the middle of the night or I'd get a fax, and it was much more, I think, time consuming and worrisome then than it is now.
Yeah.
So certainly from that aspect of the sort of social networking and instant email and all that, it's been an amazing advantage to me, I think, in being able to do things on a small scale across the world.
Yeah. Do you think about security at all for your projects?
Yeah, it's a big deal. Obviously, I think it hit everybody after 9/11 about what are the risks in these buildings, because they're very much on stage, and so they would be high-profile targets. It's a tough problem because usually the security is thought about, well, we have to keep everybody at the gate and check them as they come through. That's the sort of natural response, like the airport. The problem with that is you end up with a mass of people waiting, trying to get in. So that, I think, is the weak link. So I think, again, technology, I'm sure, is going to solve that in quicker ways to scan people. But yeah, it's always a concern. Certainly having parking under the building, that's something we don't do anymore. That used to be, wow, it'd be great if we could park under the building. We wouldn't do that anymore.
Interesting.
So it has affected it.
Yeah. What else about your job that people might not understand or might think is unique? Or tell me back to the technology, what kind of tools you use to design these buildings?
Well, yeah, it's funny. I'm probably a bit of a dinosaur because I still use a fountain pen, and I do the sketching on the napkin. But everybody else that works here is incredibly better and capable at using a computer. Yeah. And that's another place.
I hear that as a common theme, though, across designer. Alan Cooper, who was the guy who designed a lot of things in Windows, long ago, said you should use a pencil. because
Yeah.
he said, first of all, the client doesn't buy into it, and can have a good discussion about does the stop button really belong there or here,
Right.
And when you show them a UI that looks finished, they buy into it and they figure that can't be moved.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. And I've worried that one of the downsides of the technology and the fact that it's become so easy and fast for kids to learn how to design on computers, that it makes it difficult for them to adjust quickly with a client. I mean, no matter how fast the computer is, like if you put a rendering in front of a client and they want to, well, can I just turn it this way, or what does it look like it's not that easy.
Yeah.
Whereas with a pen, I can usually talk my way through that. So that's one of those places where I think you need both. Technology's great, but there's nothing that can replace the idea of having a quick pen and being able to sketch in front of a client. I think in our practice, it's there's a really strong balance between the sort of hyper reality renderings, which clients love, but it's hard to replace a big foam model too. I mean, we can change things on this. We can perceive the building in ways that in a rendering, again, it's like a picture of something, but you can't get into it the way you can with a physical model. So
Yeah.
I don't know that, I guess I'm a believer that the profession will always have those parallel paths, because I think there's such value in some of the basic sculpting and sketching that goes along with it.
Yeah. How much of a building is aesthetic? Because I see a lot of things that are aesthetic, but how much is just to hold it up too?
Well, in stadiums.
And how much do you have to understand of that, right?
Yeah. Oh, well, a lot. Yeah. You really, particularly in these buildings, because they're so structurally driven. There's so much of the cost. I think it must be close to 60% of the cost of the building is the structure itself.
The steel that goes into it and the concrete.
The concrete and all that. So if you're not, the trick of designing these buildings is get your beauty out of those pieces. And that's what I think is really, that's when you're making true architecture, is when you're not covering it up with finishes and marble and stainless steel and things like that. You really are getting the beauty out of the basic structure. So we have to have a pretty strong innate sense of what you can do. And then we have engineers, we'll all do a sketch or we'll do a model and say, okay, we want to hang that scoreboard out that far, can we really do that? We have some sense that we need to cross brace it, but we don't know how big that cross brace needs to be, and then the engineer comes in and helps us with that. So it's a pretty fine dance there, but there's not a lot of fat in these buildings.
Yeah.
When you have to put a railing and there's 10 miles of railing in the building, that adds up pretty quickly. So you've got to make it a pretty efficient railing. And so the prettiness and the sexiness of it has to come out of the sort of big moves that are inherently there in the size and scale of the structure.
Yeah. Do you study earthquake behavior on buildings like this? Or?
Yeah. Yeah, and it has a significant impact on buildings, depending on where you're building.
Yeah.
In LA, it's a huge deal. Tokyo, big deal. So I've gone through it a lot. And it's always funny when you think, well, God, why is that? Some of the columns in Staples Center, I felt like we could have put apartments in them. They were so big, and part of it is that resisting earthquake loads.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's important.
Do you think of other uses other than what the main use is? I mean, in New Orleans, you saw during Katrina, it became a refugee camp, right?
Yeah.
Do you think about that at all? Or?
Well, it was interesting. I was interviewed by NPR when that happened, because they asked me, do you think about this? And I said, these buildings are meant to hold people for 3 hours, 4 hours, so they're not made to sleep in. And while they're big and they have services, those services are usually brought in that day. They're loaded up and they're taken away. It's not a permanent overnight building. And so that was, I think, one of the big reasons that it became such an uncomfortable situation so quickly. But we do think about alternative uses a lot, because again, the football stadium, it's used 14 times a year by the football team. If they get 2 teams, they can double that. But still, compared to a Staples Center, which can be used over 300 times a year. That was the big driver in the Japanese building, is that how can we make it flexible in so many different ways that you can use it many more times. That's a green idea, it's a revenue generating idea, it just makes the building far more flexible and make more sense.
You mentioned the green word. That's interesting. Do you think about that? The impact now of a building on the environment, or?
Yeah, I have to say that sports architecture is probably late to that game. On a personal level, for me, it's one of those things that the built environment is such a huge contributor to the problem. I mean, when I can't think of the statistic right off the top of my head, but compared to cars, our built environment is far worse contributor to greenhouse gases.
Really?
Yeah, and energy use and all those things. So I think that's very much the future. There shouldn't be an architect on the planet that's not an imperative issue for them. So yeah, we're thinking about it a lot now. And one of the kind of downside in the U.S., there's the LEEDs is the sort of catchphrase, and in reality, I think LEEDs was a good thing to get people to start talking about it.
What's LEEDs?
LEEDs is energy. I'm trying to think of what the acronym stands for, but it's the acronym that describes the program that makes sure that buildings are energy efficient.
Okay.
And so when you design a building that is green, you can reach certain LEEDs certification for it.
Okay.
I should know this, it's just not coming off the top of my head what the acronym stands for.
That's what Wikipedia is for, right?
Yeah, there you go. But in places like Europe, where energy cost has been high for a long time, you'll find their buildings were way beyond a typical LEEDs building because they had to be. It was worth the investment to figure out how to save energy. So in this building, the fact that we're building into the hill is a big part of the green strategy because we're using so much less, like 40% less steel. So you're not buying that steel, you're not shipping it and all those things, taking out less materials, everything becomes a green strategy in a sort of passive way.
Yeah. That's cool.